Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yesterday we ended our lecture with a discussion of almost one of the last few end parts of the back of a book. We were discussing the illustration credits, and I left you with the idea that in some books that have a lot of illustrations, maybe pictures of artworks or photograph, sometimes even diagrams, maps, whatever they may be. By illustration, here we are often referring to any kind of visual material that is used in a book. Often, depending on the kind of book, it may be an editorial decision to not have very enormous captions right on the page. On the page, the focus needs to remain on the artwork, and you may have a much more minimal caption appearing just below the picture. The rest of the caption details in that case may be reproduced at the end of a book or at the beginning of a book, and that section is known as illustration credits. I had also mentioned that an illustration in its full should have the name of the person who has created that artwork, then the title of the artwork, the size, or something that we refer to as the dimensions, which is often the width and the height. Sometimes there is a depth also, depending on what kind of artwork it is, followed by the medium. Is it oil on canvas? Is it watercolor? Is it a charcoal drawing on handmade paper? In the case of photographs, is it a digital print? Is it a silver print, etc.? This must be followed also, very importantly, by the date of the artwork's creation. People need to know when that artwork was created. Sometimes we also give the location. We mention where that artwork may be found, in a museum somewhere, or in maybe somebody's private collection. And last but not least, it is courteous to mention who has taken a photograph of that artwork that is reproduced in the book, or who has made it possible to reproduce that. So sometimes you will see a line that says image, courtesy, etc., etc., and somebody's name or an institution's name. Image courtesy IIT Kanpur means that somebody at IIT Kanpur has made it possible for that photograph to be reproduced. Image courtesy the National Gallery of Art, New Delhi, means the National Gallery of Art has made it, somehow has taken that photograph and then shared it with the author. These are what comprise illustration credits. Now we are almost at the end of our discussion on the back matter. There are two other small possibilities that might feature in a book. This part that I am about to discuss is the index. If you can see it on my screen, then you can see that it is a 4-column text. I have taken the index from the same wider book that I was discussing with you earlier, where I told you that because the reading line cannot be more than between 4.5 to 5.5 inches ideally, then in very wide format books, we do break the text up into columns. An index often appears at the end of serious academic textbooks, at the end of research-oriented books, at the end of books that are primarily in the non-fiction category. An index is usually compiled by the author and comprises all the very, very important and recurrent themes, people, places, events, etc. that feature in the book. It is as if the key words in the book have been picked out, they have been summarized at the back, they are arranged in alphabetical order. That is what is called an index. In your head, if you can think of it as an index of names, places, people, categories, etc. It's very important in serious non-fiction, academic, research-oriented books to have such an index at the back, because it helps the reader get a bird's eye view of what is under discussion. So, for example, if there is a book on the Indian independence movement and you turn to the back and you might find names like Nehru, Gandhi, etc., Netaji, so on and so forth. So, what will happen? You'll get the name and then you get the page numbers on which each person has been mentioned. That way, you can see how much of the book is devoted to which subject or which person, and it lets you know whether then you want to read the book or you want to buy the book, because it has information on specific things. An index is an alphabetical list. An alphabetical list must be arranged with a hanging indentation so that the word in question sticks out a little bit in the margin, and the numbers, if they run over onto multiple lines, then the numbers come with a little bit of an indentation. Indexes are often the very last thing of the back matter in a book. Very rarely there might be the occasion in the book that you're designing, depending on what you're designing, for a page called the colophon. The colophon is a leftover from a much older tradition of bookmaking. Once upon a time, when books were done and printed by hand, sometimes the paper was actually made specially by somebody. The typeface was carved in wood or metal by yet another person. Illustrations were done by somebody. The binding with cloth was done by another person, etc. So, not those who contributed to the written content, but those who contributed to the production and to the material of the book, who designed the typeface, who prepared the paper, who got the cloth. Sometimes the cloth could have been specially patterned cloth or specially embossed cloth or cloth specially woven to bind this particular hardback. All of those other creators of the material of the book, they were usually thanked and mentioned on the last page. So, the colophon deals, just as the title page deals with those who created the manuscript, the colophon deals with people who have created the other materials that went into producing the book. This page has largely and very unfortunately become redundant these days, because as you may be aware, there are large paper mills that are producing paper in bulk. Typefaces have now become digital entities and are freely sometimes available on the internet, or just, you can pay and buy, but you often don't know who has created them. Many, if not all parts of book production have now become mechanized. Sometimes all of this happens in one printing press, and you may remember initial in the front matter when we discussed the title verso, then I said that as long as you thank the printer, many people write in the copyright verse, so many publishers say printed and bound at, which means the printing and the binding happened at this particular printing press. They were responsible for all this. They managed to get the paper, they got the book binding done, etc., etc. Because of this overall mechanization and digitization of the bookmaking process, the use of the colophon has largely disappeared. A colophon may now appear on, we would call, if you are ever producing what we would call a limited edition of a book, maybe 20 copies, maybe 30 copies, printed then on an old-fashioned printing press, using very specially produced paper, etc. When it almost becomes like a craft, when you are doing it in a very limited quantity, perhaps in your studio, perhaps you are a bookmaker in the old-fashioned sense of the term, then the colophon will be useful. But otherwise, sadly, the back matter these days, more often than not, tends to end with the index. Now, with this, I will be concluding the ideal arrangement of all the three parts of the book. We have therefore discussed in detail the front matter, the heart of the book, which is the main text, and then the back matter. I hope you will be careful about remembering the sequence. If you ever forget, you can always look up on the internet, search with parts of the book and their arrangement, and you will find your answer about how to represent, and most importantly, in what sequence to represent the different parts of the book. And within each part, look to establish harmony, unity, and yet a little bit of variety, with the use of typography, as I have been discussing repeatedly. Today, I would like to, since I just ended with the word typography, I would like to discuss some typesetting tips with all of you, which you should keep in mind when you start work on any document that is meant for publication. Keep this in mind. The first rule that we have, if you can see it on the screen, is something that I have been mentioning. While variety is important, don't use too many typefaces. 2 typefaces is often more than enough. As I have written on the slide, stick to 2. At the very most, you may use 3. Often 3 is also too much. It will lead to confusion in your mind. It will lead to confusion in the mind of the reader. Versatile use of the same font family lets you know that there's a professional at work. By versatile use, I mean that you are being clever about just creating the illusion of typographic difference by using features or type styles such as italics, bold, all capitals or all caps, small capitals or small caps, and by creating variations in the sizes of your text. Right? Rather than using 5, 6, 7, 8 different kinds of text, you can make the same typeface look different depending on what style and what size you are using it at. As you can see on this very slide itself, there are merely 2 typefaces. All the variations that I have presented you with, I have created by varying my styles and by varying my sizes. Consider the difference or the contrast between a serif font and a non-serif font. You can see on the screen, the serif font is the font that we are used on the whole for reading purposes. Serif fonts, as I have mentioned earlier, is a distilled graphic representation of the handwriting that once was used to copy books or write books in the days of the manuscripts. A non-serif font is the smoother, more modern, crisper variety, primarily used for reading on devices and for reading online, and therefore is widely used on the internet. Use these 2 fonts to create different levels of text, as well as to create a difference between the body text and the running heads or running feet. Body text should ideally not be above 11 point and never below 8 points. Below 8 point body text will be impossible to read on paper. You will end up squinting and it is just not acceptable. 8 on its own is still quite small. I would recommend minimum body text should really be 10. Some sizes vary. The reason we are saying you can go between 10, 10.5, sometimes 10.75 or 11. You can vary it simply because different typefaces are created at slightly different sizes. So if you are using a typeface like Garamond, you may need to use 11. But if you are using a typeface like Baskerville or New Baskerville, you may then need to use 10 or even sometimes 9.75 because Baskerville on its own is a slightly larger font than Garamond. So when you're typesetting, the best thing to do is to choose a body text font, change the size to, let's say, 10 to begin with. Then if you have access to a printout, just print out one sheet. You don't need to print out the whole book. You don't even need to print out the whole chapter. Print out one page, hold it in front of you, read it, and then see how readable it is and whether you need to go big or you need to go slightly smaller. Another concern with varying the typeface size is that it helps to reduce or expand the number of pages. So if your publisher or your client has told you the book must end within 108 pages, 10-point Baskerville might be giving you 120 pages, in which case you are 10 pages over. In that case, you select all your text and just reduce the type size from 10 to maybe 9.5, and you will see that you immediately come back to within what your page limit was. It's important to respect the page limit because the page limit is connected to cost. You may be thinking that in one book, if I was requested to do the book at 110 pages and I've gone up to 120, what is the big deal? It's only 10 pages. But remember that at a minimum, publishers print 1,000 copies per title. At a minimum, sometimes even maybe 500, 800, 1,000 is the most economic print run. So if you have 10 extra pages per book, multiply that by 1,000. That is many extra pages and a lot of paper, and the poor publisher will have to end up paying for that. The publisher will have no option but to add the cost of that extra paper to the price of the book in order to try and survive in the business. The readers may or may not want to pay that extra money, and the book might then end up suffering because of this. So, people who plan the book, the publisher, the author, the editor, the sales and marketing team, or you may be designing for a corporate who wants an annual report, anything, you will have been given a request to stick to a certain page limit. Now, within reason, you can manipulate that if you've overshot by playing around a little with the typeface size, but remember, body text ideally is a minimum of 10 point, otherwise that book will be readable. It will be unreadable, I beg your pardon. Always endnotes, footnotes, references, the index and the glossary. We have just discussed all this. You know that many parts of this form the back matter of a book. They can all be in a font size that is smaller than the body text, although we advise in most cases, especially for the notes, references, page numbers can be smaller. Page numbers can be even in size 7, it's not a problem. Numbers are designed slightly larger than the alphabet, and even in 7 point, numbers are visible, but the notes, the references, they are not as important, but they must nevertheless be readable. Don't go below 8. If you keep a note of these values, then you can't go wrong. The rule 2 is, while you are working, then you have to keep a note of the various kinds of elements that will be coming on the page and that will require your attention. So, when you receive a manuscript, open it up in Microsoft Word. Often the manuscript will be in Microsoft Word to begin with. You open it up, just glance through it and see what are the aspects of a book that are present in this book. Does it, of course, sometimes it may or may not have a table of contents, it may or may not have a dedication. Does it have complicated sections inside? Within a chapter, does it have many kinds of subheadings? You will recall that book like the Nested Russian Doll that I mentioned, which had subhead A, B, C, D, etc., in which case you have to plan. The minute you see that there are 2 or 3 different kinds of subhead mentally on a sheet of paper or in a notebook, you can make a note, okay, then my subhead A will be bold, my subhead B will be all small caps, my subhead C will be perhaps italics, right? You have to plan and you have to then continue with that scheme throughout the book. So often it helps to maintain what we call a style sheet. Style here refers to the different typographic styles that you will be using through a particular document. The first thing, like I said, we do is make a note of the levels of subhead that are present in the text. That is, plan the hierarchy. Remember, I said most important thing will be the biggest, second thing will be slightly smaller, third thing will be even smaller. This is your text hierarchy and you must plan it before you begin to typeset. The editor must communicate it to the book designer. If the editor has not communicated this hierarchy to the book designer should ask. You have to decide whether to go for a serif look or a serif and a non-serif combination. The aesthetics of this and whether to go for this combination may not necessarily come as an instruction from the editor. It may be an aesthetic decision that you have to take on your own. The combination It is not mandatory that every book have a serif and a non-serif combination. The combination is very useful when there is a lot of secondary text in a book. As you will see on the slide, what I have said is this is particularly useful for books with a lot of tables, charts and or technical information, also those with pictures and accompanying captions. A lot of other kinds of text appearing on the page. Maybe imagine putting all the secondary text in a non-serif font so that the reader visually has one more level of assistance from you. The main text carries on in a serif font. Everything else which they can read at level 2, everything else they can read when they have the time, that appears in a non-serif font. Even within the combination, it is better to stick to the same size and simply vary the style of the font you wish to use. Garamond 10 point remains the same throughout, but in some cases it becomes Garamond 10 point bold. In some cases it becomes Garamond 10 point italic. In some cases it becomes Garamond 10 point all caps, and somewhere else in 10 point still it becomes all small caps. Now you understand what I mean by saying you don't always have to play with the size, but you can play with these stylistic features that are available to you. You will see at the bottom, chapter heading or the display title must always be ideally in a size larger than the text. It is a display title and is not counted as part of the body text. But then you have subhead A, you have subhead B, subhead A gets bold, subhead B gets all small caps, subhead C gets italics, and OMG, if you have subhead D, maybe contemplate just changing the color of subhead D. You can just reduce the percentage of black, thereby you apply a shade of black. You all may be familiar with the idea that a lighter shade of black just gives you gray. The use of gray does not cost extra when you go to print the book, so you don't have to worry about incurring costs. You don't have to add red or blue or green, that will send the cost up, but you can definitely use a shade of gray. Over here you can see I am sharing two samples with you. The first one, the display title is the same as the body text, but the size has been made much larger, so that size, which is very large, which is possibly about 24 point, perhaps if not 26 or 28, that coupled with the space after it is helping establish it on the page as the display title. On the right hand side page, we have not made it that large, but we have made it all caps, and this is helping. Even though it's quieter, the presence of the display title is a little more quiet on the right hand side, but because we have changed the style and the space after it, you don't have any problem in understanding what is the display title. On the left hand side, subhead A appears with upper lower small caps. On the other side, it appears as all small caps, no problem. Both possibilities are okay. And down below you can see that the next level of subhead, in both instances we have chosen to go with italics. All of the typeface is the same typeface on both pages. We have just created the illusion of visual difference by playing with the styles. I hope the matter of the styles is becoming much more clear to you. Please also note the difference in the use of space. The maximum amount of space has been saved for the biggest heading, which is the display title. The second level of space has been saved for just before subhead A, and the third level, if before subhead A you have 2 line space, then before subhead B or the italicized title you have 1 finger space or 1 line space. So please note how with the changes in the levels of subheadings, the space above each subheading is also changing. This space above that I am referring to constantly, you can alter it by looking for, on your page layout software, a tab that says space before. Look for space before and you can add it or decrease it depending on what you are designing. Here we have 2 tables for you. I prefer the table on the left, which is combining non-serif with serif font. The table on the right is also a possibility where the typeface has not changed. It is the same typeface, but we have created at least some illusion of difference by using all small caps on the top row. Okay? Instead of being boring and getting all the data, everything looking identical, some attempt has been made to isolate what we are looking at where. Over here, we have a very interesting sample for you. In this particular book, the page on the left has margin notes. I have mentioned this earlier. It was part of the ideal arrangement lectures that in some books, especially if they are wide format books, there is a possibility of making the text box slightly more narrow, but not wasting the margin and using it to have the text which forms parts of the notes. We have still on this also applied hanging indentation. So you will notice the number 1 and the number 2. That makes it very easy for the reader to get to whichever note they want to read. But what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that in the text of the notes and on the right page for the caption, we have used a non-serif font. This is perfectly permissible, and in fact, it's quite wonderful if you do take the time to do this, because it just sets the secondary text very visually apart from the body text, which, as you can see, is just continuing in a serif font. Rule number 3 is the effective and intelligent use of leading. Leading is the space between the lines of type, and if you use it cleverly, it can help reduce your book by many pages. If you use it cleverly, it can sometimes also help increase your book by many pages. Leading is interlinear space. It can be manipulated from the little option that often appears alongside or underneath the slot on your typesetting software, which allows you to change the font. Leading often can just be kept at 0 point or auto. Every typeface that you choose comes with a default leading. A quick way of arriving at that leading, which in Microsoft Word we often know or see as single line space. Single line space in Microsoft Word means no leading. 1.5, you'll see there are options in Microsoft Word, 1.5 lines, 2 line space, double line space. All of these means you are increasing the leading or increasing the interlinear space. When you come into Quark Express or when you come into InDesign, you don't have the option of saying single line or double line. You must add a point. Usually the calculation is leading is 120% of your typeface. Often if you have size 10, I really did not know this math until very recently, but often 10 point with 14 leading, 10 point with 13 leading is perfectly adequate depending on the kind of book. We like to put a little bit of extra leading in the case of works on philosophy or travel, definitely in lit works of fiction. Sometimes for the academic books which are fairly dense in their argument, we need to pack in as much as we can into the pages, because the book on the other hand must be reasonably priced for students to be able to buy them. In that case, we don't apply additional leading, we just choose 0 point or auto leading. When you are manipulating leading, obviously common sense tells you that if you increase the leading, right? If you increase the leading, the lines will be spread more apart and the pages will increase because the text will overflow. The more you reduce the space between the lines, more text will fit on a page, and therefore you save pages at the end. Leading, the value of your leading must never be less than the size of your typeface. So if your typeface is 10, either you have 0 point or automatic leading, or the value that you choose for your leading is more than the typeface. So size 10 on 12 or size 10 on 14, but never size 10 on 9, never size 10 on 8. If you do that, the result that you will get is basically the 2 lines that you see in the middle of my page, where I have said leading should never be so decreased as to have the letters of one line overlap those of another. If the letters of one line are touching the lines above it, then that is bad leading. That is not how readable text should be. even on automatic leading, there is in fact a very nice thin line to separate the letters. And over here there is the maths, and often recommended value of leading is 120%. So if nothing else, if your type size is 10 and you put 12 leading, you should be absolutely okay. Over here you will notice on these 2-page samples that I am sharing with you, the leading on the right hand side has been slightly decreased. Therefore, you will notice at the bottom of the right hand side page, there are 2 lines in red. The 2 lines in red have entered the page because leading was decreased, but as you can see, I have been very gentle with it. So at first sight, when you are just looking at the 2 pages, when you're just comparing the 2 pages, it's not very possible to realize what has happened. It has been very, very gently reduced. And another little trick that we have played, which takes you a little bit of time to realize, is that we have slightly reduced the space after the display title right on top of the page. So if you compare the left and the right, you will see that the right page begins 1 line higher than the page on the left. But note how the leading has managed to squeeze in 2 more sentences on this page, and you can now imagine if the entire book was 120 pages and you reduce the leading very slightly. Now when I say very slightly, I mean if all over the book you have 14, try first reducing it to 13.5. Try first reducing it to 13.6 or 7. Come down in very, very slow degrees. If you are cheating with the leading, if you have 14 on one page, the facing page you can maybe only come down to 13.6 or 13.5. I would even advise you to never change the leading on only one page. If you are trying to fit more lines into a page, or if you have a dangling line at the bottom which is called a widow, or a dangling line on top of the next page which is called an orphan, to prevent these widow orphans, sometimes we slightly reduce the leading. Please reduce it across both pages so that left and right to the reader look identical. Please don't have 14 leading on one side and 13 on the other, because trust me, the reader will be able to tell and it becomes disruptive of the reading process. Good leading manipulation should be like the application of good makeup, which is the person looks very beautiful, but you think they look like that all the time. You can't tell that something has been enhanced. Please bear this in mind. Kerning is another important feature of good typography. Kerning is the space between 2 characters. Sometimes we use it to avoid excessive hyphenation. Sometimes we use it to avoid the hanging word at the edge of a paragraph. Only a word, especially only a 2-letter word, only a 3-letter word, or a hyphenated word which is hanging over and into the last line of a paragraph, or hanging alone and isolated at the top of a new page, that is undesirable in good typography. So what you can do is you can highlight not just the sentence. Please don't highlight only a sentence. Please highlight the entire paragraph and then look on your typesetting software for a place often very near the leading option. Something will give you the option of tracking or kerning. Many softwares use this interchangeably. Tracking or kerning lets you very, very gently reduce the space between the characters and helps pull up those 2 or 3 or 4 alphabets that were dangling and taking up an entire line. Kerning should, like leading, kerning should never be so decreased as to have the characters overlap. Okay, the letters should not then start clinging to each other. It's a very, I would recommend you first start with minus. When you're trying to fix it, you have to put a negative value, unlike leading, which is always a greater value. Tracking or kerning, you put -1. Sometimes at the most you put -2, never go higher than -2. Okay? Kerning should never be so decreased as to have the characters overlap or the effects appear visible to the reader's eye. Kerning is the art of adjusting the space between the characters so that the eye can flow easily across the copy without being distracted by discrepancies, and always, just like good design, good typographic treatment is never noticed. If you read a book and you never stopped to think about the good typography, it means the typography was in fact very good, because it just let you interact with the content, it just let you read the content, there were enough margins on the page, there was enough room on the page between the lines, all the characters were properly aligned, nothing was hanging. There was no one line isolated at the base of a page. There were no hanging words on the top of a page. All of this was actually taken care of by the intelligent typesetter who has tools like this at his disposal. And all of this is done so that when you are reading, it's only you and the content that you're reading and the thoughts that you are having about that content, and not getting interrupted with bad breaks in the book, bad use of typography. As you can see here on the example that I've got for you, weather is the state of the atmosphere as measured on a scale of hot or cold, wet or dry, etc., etc. Note the extra space between the W and the E in the very first word over here in the example that I've got for you. The W and the E, or just the W, can be selected on your screen, and you can decrease the kerning by 1 or 2 so that you will yourself notice that the W and the E come just a little closer, and the word doesn't look like W either. Now it looks like that. It should be weather, right? This problem happens simply because of the way certain typefaces are created. You can't fix it. Whoever created that W in this particular typeface didn't realize that it occupied that much space and would push the next character away by so much. But when you do notice it, if you notice it, it means the reader will notice it. It will be a bit of a break. So try and keep a lookout for instances like this where you can fix it manually. In this particular pair of pages that I have for you, again, I'm deliberately reusing the same samples over and over again. You will notice on the left-hand side, the first paragraph has a word that is hanging onto one entire line. The word agricole, I have used dummy Latin text over here. The word agricole on the left-hand side, I've marked it in red. It is hanging over the end of the paragraph, and it is occupying an entire line. Thereby, towards the end, it's also pushing over a line onto the next page. By selecting this entire paragraph, by reducing the kerning by -1 or -1.5, you will notice that now, with the adjustment of the intercharacter spaces, the word has popped up to the line above. Can you see the intelligent use of kerning there? Now, that is good intelligent use of kerning to adjust. The line at the bottom of the second paragraph that I have highlighted for you is an example of bad kerning, because as you can see, the intercharacter space in the rest of that paragraph, look closely at the black sentences, you will notice that the intercharacter space in that paragraph is much more generous. And I have done bad typesetting, I have done lazy typesetting, because I have highlighted only one sentence and squished it up. I have highlighted only one sentence and squeezed it, and you as the reader are in fact able to tell that this is what I have done. This is like applying very bad special effects to a movie, where maybe when there is somebody flying across the screen, you can see the rope or the belt that they are wearing, and you suddenly realize that they're actually not flying, they are swinging across a giant studio. So this is bad special effects. The second example, because only one line has been highlighted and it has been squeezed too much. Ideally, in good typesetting, you should select the entire paragraph and then apply a very gentle -1 or -0.5 to see if the letters get adjusted. However, another last thing for the time being that I want to draw your attention to is that by moving up the word agricole in the top paragraph with the adjustment of kerning, we have in fact earned an extra sentence at the bottom of the page. There is now a third line. Earlier, the leading allowed us 2 red lines at the base of this page. Now we have 3 red lines at the base of this page. Therefore, kerning, leading together sometimes help us to make maximum use of the white space on the page and eventually save paper. Kerning is the intercharacter space. Tracking is the space in the entire sentence. So even the space between the words can be reduced. Tracking, and I just have to make it evident what tracking is, although I must warn you that many people do tend to use, many softwares also tend to use kerning and tracking interchangeably. The first sentence over here is very squeezed up. Tracking has been set to -50. The second one is set to 0, which means no special effects have been applied. That is just how the font appears. And in the next one, for whatever reason, tracking has been increased to 100, and then you can see how the space between the characters has increased, how even what is appearing on the first line has been affected. On the first sentence, on the first example, the first line is ending with and. In the no kerning applied, it is ending with which means we have lost 2 words. 2 words have been pushed over to the next line. And when you have increased it by 100, obviously, many more words have traveled on to the next line. Tracking or letter spacing is the space between groups of characters. It can be described as loose tracking or tight tracking. Loose tracking is when the letters have a larger distance between them. And obviously, tight tracking is the opposite. Tightly tracked line means the space between the letters have been closed up. Tracking has similar guidelines as leading, and all of these practices are tied to readability. The longer your line, the length of a line on a book, the length of a line or the length of your text block is often called the measure. The longer the measure, the longer the eye has to travel, we apply a bit of tracking, otherwise the eye gets tired. The rule is not set in stone. Variables such as typeface choice, background color, number of columns, and surrounding design elements can also influence the readability of a block of text. Each time that you are setting type, you should be looking at the overall picture. Okay, keep that in mind. Tracking and leading will be in reaction to the size of the page. It will be in reaction to the content. It will be in reaction to how luxurious or how tightly you have to set your text, because what is your eventual page count, and it will also depend on how busy is it only text or picture here, map here, diagram here, footnotes at the bottom of the page, then there's a running head at the top, there's a page number somewhere. So it must be in reaction to all of these other elements on the page. One place where tracking is essential, and I would request you to apply, is whenever you have text appearing in a colored box, especially if the color of the text is light and the color of the box is dark. In such a situation, as you can see on the screen, we say the text is appearing in reverse. Tradition has dark text, white page, but if it is ever the other way around, it is actually very hard for the eye to read. We are not accustomed to reading light text on dark background. So when you have a situation like that, you need to spread the letters out a little bit, as I have done in the second instance. So you need to then give a plus value in your tracking or your kerning. Please also note that when you have text in a colored area, in a colored box, try and not have the last and first letter touching absolutely the edges then of the box. Okay, little bit of an internal border should be left, otherwise it becomes hard to read. Hanging indentations is also something we have discussed quite a few times and must be applied to lists in a book. The left-hand side, as you can see, even though we have picked the number out in red, on the left it is considerably more difficult to read as against the list that appears on the right-hand side, where the numbers are hanging out and letting you go from point to point very, very easily. Alignment. By and large, most books have justified alignment. please note, not force justified, simply justified, which means text touches the left margin and the right margin and the paragraphs end wherever they do. This actually helps save space. Left aligned text appears often for, obviously, as you may realize, for poetry. Sometimes when you just have standalone paragraphs, maybe in a book of very meditative text or little books of philosophy or self-help, where each paragraph is like a standalone paragraph, then there is no problem if it's left aligned. But when it's a book of running text, running prose in whichever subject area, it is advisable to have justified alignment, because this actually helps make most use of your text block, and it will help sort of keep your page count under control. Rule 8 is the rule of contrasts. Different levels of information may be highlighted through the use of a shade of black, which means grey. If you are only printing and working in single color, it means you are only using black, and therefore you may just lighten the shade of black somewhere on your typesetting software. It will allow you to say 70% black, 80% black, or 40 or 30 or 50. These percentages of black are actually shades of grey, and even if you don't have multiple colors at your disposal, shades of grey can be used to create difference. We at Seagull often prefer to use grey for all our secondary text. Captions, notes, running heads, running feet, etc. may be printed in grey at no extra cost. And of course, when you have this grey along with perhaps a second typeface, along with perhaps different type styles that you are applying, the book, even if you think it's a very boring book, even if you think this book is only text, it's only going to be read by scholars, this book is in a subject that I am particularly myself not interested in, but if you typeset it following these principles, then no matter whose hands it gets into, it will be a joy to read. Tomorrow or in the next lecture, I will continue with a few other rules of good typesetting.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. Today we are going to read a section from Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando, and the section that we are going to listen to today is perhaps one of the finest descriptions of the winter season in English literature. It is also a very fine piece of what we call fantasy writing. I have made a few changes to the original to adapt it for the purpose of reading. The Great Frost was, historians tell us, the most severe that has ever visited these islands. Birds froze in mid-air and fell like stones to the ground. At Norwich, a young countrywoman started to cross the road in her usual robust health and was seen by the onlookers to turn visibly to powder and be blown in a puff of dust over the roofs. The mortality among sheep and cattle was enormous. Corpses froze and could not be drawn from the sheets. It was no uncommon sight to come upon a whole herd of swine frozen immovable upon the road. The fields were full of shepherds, ploughmen, teams of horses, and little bird-scaring boys, all struck stark in the act of the moment. one with his hand to his nose, another with a bottle to his lips, a third with a stone raised to throw at the ravens who sat upon the hedge within a yard of him, as if they were stuffed birds. The severity of the frost was so extraordinary that a kind of petrification sometimes ensued. It was commonly supposed that the great increase of rocks in some parts of Derbyshire was due to no eruption, for there was no eruptions. Rather, it was supposed that they were due to the solidification of unfortunate wayfarers who had been turned literally to stones where they stood. The church could give little help in the matter, and though some landowners had these relics blessed, the most part preferred to use them either as landmarks, scratching posts for sheep, or when the form of the stone allowed, drinking troughs for cattle, which purpose they serve admirably for the most part to this day. But while the country people suffered the extremity of want, and the trade of the country was at a standstill, London enjoyed a carnival of utmost brilliance. The new king directed that the river, which was frozen to a depth of 20 feet, should be swept, decorated, and given all the semblance of a park or pleasure ground, with arbors, mazes, alleys, drinking booths, all at his expense, of course. Frozen roses fell in showers when the queen and her ladies walked abroad. Colored balloons hovered motionless in the air. Here and there burnt vast bonfires of cedar and oak wood, lavishly salted so that the flame were of green, orange, and purple fire. But however fiercely they burnt, the heat was not enough to melt the ice, which, though of singular transparency, was yet of the hardness of steel. So clear, indeed, was the ice that there could be seen, congealed at a depth of several feet, here a porpoise, there a flounder. Shoals of eels lay motionless in a trance, but whether their state was one of death or merely of suspended animation which the warmth would revive, puzzled the philosophers. In short, nothing could exceed the brilliancy and gaiety of the scene by day. But it was at night that the carnival was at its merriest. The nights were of perfect stillness. The moon and stars blazed with the hard fixity of diamonds, and to the fine music of flute and trumpet the courtiers danced. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippet.
I am A.K. Sharma and I teach sociology at IIT Kanpur. I am going to address the question, what is the relevance of statistics in sociology? In India, there is some confusion about role of statistics in sociology, and most of the students of sociology suffer from what I call phobia of statistics. But actually, if you look at history of sociology or the kind of works that are being done in sociology, which are published in prestigious academic journals, you find that there is a lot of use of statistical methods, and not simple methods, very advanced methods. All of you know, as students of sociology, you know that one of the founding fathers of sociology, Comte, or another founding father Emile Durkheim. They said that sociology is one subject which differs from other subjects in the questions that they try to answer, but they use the same method, the method of science. And that in sociology, those who believe in this kind of approach, they are called positivists. Emile Durkheim called them positivists. They believe that social issues must be studied by using observations, experiments and other modes of collection of data. Now, statistics can help sociologists in three ways. Because if sociology is about social facts or patterns, not individuals, patterns of thinking, patterns of feeling, patterns of acting, behaving, and they can be measured, they can be quantified, and that explanation of one social fact can be given only in terms of other facts. We need statistics, because statistics can measure these facts, statistics can describe these facts. So, one branch of statistics, we can call it descriptive statistics, can help us in summarizing data, in measuring facts, like you are all familiar with simple statistical things like mean, mode, median, or methods of dispersion, standard deviation, range, variance. These are descriptive measures. They can also be used to measure skewness or symmetry or asymmetry in the data. Other types of statistical methods, which are called inferential statistics, are used to test hypotheses. We know that any science, including sociology, if we follow that positivistic tradition, is about testing hypotheses using scientific methods. And for testing hypotheses, like for comparative purposes, comparing means of two samples or comparing variances of two samples or comparing correlation coefficients or regression coefficients, we need inferential statistics. And if you are familiar with some of them, t-test, z-test, chi-square test, f-test, these are the tests which come under inferential statistics. We use statistics for drawing inferences about two or more samples. And thirdly, statistics can also be used for posing new questions. I remember that a few months ago, I read an article in Population and Development Review in which the authors Cole and Gramajo, they tried to explain homicide rates and variations in homicide rates across countries in the entire world. And they found, based on statistical analysis, logistic regression and all, they found that one factor which explains variations in homicide rates in the world is female education. Not culture, not governance so much, not even male education, but female education. Now, if facts are showing this, so you have a new sociological question, why is it that rise in female education leads to higher homicide rates? And Cole and Gramajo then gave certain hypotheses. You may not agree with those hypotheses, you may conduct this study on your own or test these hypotheses given by Cole and Gramajo using statistical methods. But the point I am making, that in addition to describing data, drawing inferences, statistical methods can also be used for raising new questions in sociology. And of course, you are all familiar that whenever the issue of prediction comes, predicting population of India, predicting urbanization, predicting per capita income of India 20 years from now, 50 years from now, there also statistical methods are of great help. And finally, statistical methods have been used in monitoring and evaluation of development policies run by various governments and NGOs. Thank you very much.